So how's the radiator made? Well, I'll show two different kinds here. This is a crappy car one. Actually, this wouldn't have been so crap in its day because this is actually copper. And this is the standard way they still make car ones today, except they make them in aluminium, and I am not up on making aluminium radiators at all. So here's what I was saying about the little strip they get of the zigzag, and as you can see there's louvers in there. They're just little louvers, and this is like the ones we used to have at air radiators. They cut one louver in one direction and another one in the other direction. Now this one only has two tubes in it. Some of them may have three. I've seen ones that have got, oh holy cow, like 9 tubes going across. And yeah, some of the copper in this has rotted out. So you get to see it there. You see you get your little lines there. That's where the actual copper has attached to the tubes originally. But quite a bit of this is rotted out. Now, I shall go and show you the other kind. While we're on the thing, that bit up in there, where your tubes go through, that's considered your header plate. But with this, it doesn't have a individual header plate and then the tank. The header plate is actually part of the tank, and then they get another piece here at the top, and they have like a groove. I've seen ones with it on the top, but this is probably, yeah, it's underneath this one, where they actually sit one part of the tank into the other part, and there's sort of like a groove where they sit in together, and then they run solder and a blowtorch over that. Of course, they've got to use flux. They put flux on first, and then sit the solder, against it as they run the blowtorch right along it. And they also solder in the outlet pipes. But I'll go and have a look at the other kind. Okay. Well, this kind here, I hope we can actually see this, is the kind like we used to build at air radiators. I think it'll be better. Here we go. There we go. Now your tubes actually go through the middle of your fins. Now this is quite a width, this one. This is probably only, oh cripes, yeah, 6 FPI. There's what they call FPI, which stands for fins per inch, and it's where they measure along here. And some of the ones we had were 8 or 12, but this is actually very big gaps compared to a lot of the radiators that I dealt with. Although some were like this, some of the intercoolers and that were like this. But yeah, that's the kind that 98% of what we built was like that. Air radiators. So, how do they make radiators? Well, basically the tubes themselves have solder on them, and they dip. Some of the tubes are actually a piece of metal that are just sort of put in a loop, like sheet metal, and they've folded it to shape and then just sort of had a seam. I think the ones that air radiators are actually ERW, which is electric resistance weld, which is what you see in standard bits of RHS and stuff like that. But I've seen some very crappy car ones in America made many years ago, where they just literally had sheet metal and they folded it over and then they soldered it along that seam. I'm pretty sure the air radiator ones, they do an ERW seam, electric resistance weld, as I just said. And then what they do is they get all this in flux. You've got to stick it in flux and then solder it, because the flux is a chemical deoxidizing agent that basically strips off any of the oxides and allows another metal to fuse with it. And it can't if there's any form of rust. But the trouble is, as soon as this hits the air, there's essentially rust on it straight away. Only a very thin layer. You'll never see it with the naked eye, but technically speaking, there will be oxides. So to strip that off, you've got to have flux on there, and then you can hit it with a solder. And it actually has what they call an intermetallic layer, which is essentially bronze when you do that, when you put flux on the copper and then you hit it with a solder, you get this very thin layer of bronze, which is really, really thin, that you will never really notice, that goes between the copper and the rest of the solder. But that's just, it sort of alloys between the copper and the solder to create this intermetallic layer. But that's something that you don't know unless you're really up on this sort of crap. I actually found that one out on the internet. Back when me and another bloke were arguing on the toss about flux and what flux actually does. So yeah, but they have, on the ones that air radiators, they had 70-30 solder on the tubes. And then some of the fins, they would actually get the whole roll of copper and dip that in flux the same way, and it had come to us from ADRAD already like that. And then they would, stamp them to shape and then build the radiator. And then there were most of them where they were just straight copper, and they'd, have those rolls running through machines that just stamped it out, and cut it all to size and all that, and you just have these copper fins, and that was the majority of them. How many? I'd say 90%, maybe nearly 95%, were just plain copper. And then, of course, as I said, you have what they call the jig, where there's all the dimples, and you slide all the fins into the dimples, and you slide the tubes through the fins, like the one I just showed you, the car one I showed you. They just get the zigzag and tubes, and then they lay the zigzag on the tubes. That was only the zigzag tubes was only about 2% of what they done. 98% of what they done was ones like I just showed you there in the old tractor. And basically, after they've put them together like that, they've got to dip them in flux or spray flux over the top. Different places do it differently, but that all pretty much just means it gets covered in flux. And then they put it in an oven, and this is a seriously hot thing that brings it to, what is it, like 330 degrees Celsius or something like that. And then they pull it out, and you got to have these fancy gloves on to hold it, these real heat-proof things, not just welding gloves, real serious gloves. And they pick it up and whack it on this table thing, and then they have things that sort of square it up. It's a big board, and you've got bits you hold, and then there's another bit that you push a board from the other side, and it makes it perfectly plumb and square, so that then the header plates will fit, and all the side supports and all the bits and pieces will fit on it properly. And this table has a whole bunch of holes in it, and a big fan underneath with a bit of a flue thing going, and you hit a button and the fan starts up and sucks air through it. So basically you've dipped it in flux, you've put it in the oven, the solder on the tubes has melted and adjoined the copper fins, joined to them, and then you pull it out and you let it cool, but it's got to be kept perfectly square as it cools. But you don't just sit it there and let it cool, you've got this big fan underneath the table with all the holes in the table sucking through, and it'll cool it in literally like not even 2 minutes. It'll be completely cool. And then that's your basic thing. Then you go and flare your tops out, put your header plates on, and they get fuse welded, which is a robotic TIG welder that sticks all that together. Now, I'm told in the United States they don't basically do it that way. They go the cheap-ass way. They just go straight from there, and they just put the header plate on, and then they just solder it. Air radiators would do a good job. It gives you 10 to 15 times the strength by fuse welding the tubes to the header plate. This is why you get these good jobs. This is why you get a good reputation. This is why you get to do the military stuff and all this, because they had this robot that would fuse weld all the tubes to the header plate. And I'm not joking, some of these things almost were completely... There's only very few bits that when they soldered them did the solder actually come through, because the vast majority of these tubes, I've seen ones that were over 98%, of them were completely perfectly fuse welded and they wouldn't leak through that way, but you've got to put solder on it anyway. But in the States, in cheapoville companies, they don't even bother fuse welding it, they just solder it. And of course you don't have the 10 to 15 fold the strength that you do when you fuse weld it. And that basically makes your core, and the rest is just bent sheet metal, holes, and a lot of welding, and a lot of nuts and bolts and gaskets.